Shall I show the camera as well? Yes. Turn it on. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Siviwe Bangani, and I'm the Director of Research Services in the library, and I will be chairing the session this afternoon. We've got Mr. Jeremiah Peterson to actually monitor the charts online, as well as Paulette. So they will be doing a good job in terms of doing that. And we have a very busy lineup of 5 speakers from 5 different departments to approach the subject of climate justice and open access from different perspectives. This was really a deliberate, thing from our side to have diverse voices speak during this week, so that it is clear that climate justice and open access do not reside in a single department, but cut across all disciplines. I will introduce each of the speakers before they speak. I'll give each speaker a maximum of 25 minutes, that's 20 to 25 minutes to speak. And then there will be, 5 to 10 minutes time for discussions after each presentation. First up will be Professor Chris Reddy. Prof. Reddy is an emeritus professor in the Department of Curriculum Studies in the Faculty of Education here at Stellenbosch. His research interests include curriculum studies, environmental education, and teacher education. He has published regularly in all 3 areas, in journal articles, book chapters, and popular articles in professional journals. He's also the coordinator of the environmental education program here at Stellenbosch. He has been involved with funded national research projects and also served as a project leader for projects in Stellenbosch and other parts of the country with in-service teachers. He will speak to environmental education and safe space for humanity. Prof. Reddy?
Yeah. I'm just going to... Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. The people in the room and whoever is linked up online. So I'll use up some of my time by just giving you a broad perspective. We work, as our chair indicated, in the field of education and environmental education in particular. And I'm going to just give a broad overview of the perspective we take on environment, how we see ways of, let's say, merging environment and education, what attempts were made using education as a response to environmental issues and problems, and then take a particular perspective, which I think through working in the field and working with others is a way of, not the way, and there are no ways, individual ways, but a way that we might move and actually respond to issues and problems that confront us. So I'll just, in the meantime, develop a perspective on environment and how we use environment in the field of education. Okay, what's happening here? Why does it say here? Next slide. There you go. Okay. I'm just going to just use that. The arrow key. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. He's already introduced me, so I'll just put that up there. When we spoke about the whole idea of problems and so on, the thought crossed my mind that, can we do something and can we actually create some kind of safe space in this difficult and really hostile period, let's call it, of the Earth's history. Okay, so we know that we work with natural and the human-made environments. Humans have done quite a bit of, let's call it, structural and all kinds of other I'm going to say interventions in natural settings. And in many fields, people have set up this social, ecological, let's say, structure, okay? Where social is human and ecological is the natural. So the social world and the natural world. And as we all know, the natural world does provide us with resources. It also provides us with all sorts of what we can call ecological services. There are things like water cycles, carbon cycle, cycles of decomposition, which makes nutrients and things available again for use and to continue the cycles. And if we look at this from a, let's say, the way we described and understood natural interactions through natural science, then we have the Earth as a living planet, which is actually sustained by a number of cycles based on ecological interactions. Okay, and as humans, we've now become part of the whole setup, but maybe not within ecological flow, ecological systems, maybe outside of natural cycles. And from there, our actions and interventions have actually started to cause disruptions in ecosystem services. And this slide is from a student, which I got permission to use. And that's where part of the problem with environmental issues and the whole idea of the environment under threat is actually located. Now let's just go to some, so socio-ecological, but the scale seems to be tipping in the favor of the social, at the expense of the ecological, but at the expense of, in the bigger picture, just all who inhabit the planet, okay? And some of the more extreme perspectives are listed in my list over here. And I'll just go, is there a pointer? No. Okay. We know, you might know, but it's been well documented, the period, the geological period, the Anthropocene, which is often referred to the age of humans, sort of around about the end of the Second World War onwards, when infrastructure and developmental programs were really foregrounded, redeveloping the world after a disastrous, destructive war. Part of societal understandings or, drive in society was a global monoculture of consumerism, right? Where humans work in terms of this framework, we have to consume, and if we're not consuming and contributing to that developmental and resource extraction cycle, there's something wrong with you. This process has gotten largely out of hand. We're living beings. Habitats are culled and destroyed in the name of human production, consumption at staggering rates. Growth political economy is set up that is literally overproducing and consuming the planet to death. The resources from natural systems which fuel our consumerist lifestyle. We are perhaps going a little too far in that socio-ecological balance and maybe even consuming the planet to death. And the last one, carbon, says our technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself. And some feel that is what we're in the process of doing. So, that is the sort of set of issues and problems we find ourselves in. And from that last quote there, people feel for the first time in the history, let's say, of humankind, we are probably sitting at a point where we might be moving into a time and a space where humans would no longer inhabit the planet simply because of resource issues and problems and the other environmental problems. Just look at the last slide, which I think of this section, which so sums up where we are and the things that are happening. Storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, fires devastate large areas with huge tolls of death, injury, loss, and property, and ongoing suffering. War and conflicts all over, not just the war in Ukraine, that's fairly recent. War and conflicts surround us. Economic crises threaten the security of people and nations around the globe. And we've seen of late, there's no discrimination when there's an increase in frequency of natural disasters, fires, hurricanes and whatnot. It doesn't matter whether it's a developing country or whether it's a highly developed country. Natural disasters are equally destructive wherever they actually occur. Look at Florida, supposedly, has the best drainage system in the world and blah, blah, blah. It's flooded just about everything, right, around there. And the problem is it's flooded areas where people are living who are actually very dependent on their little abodes. They often retired people, who have, anyway. The point I'm making is it doesn't discriminate, it happens, okay, everywhere. So, in order to get a better understanding of what we're doing in environment and education, we must have a particular representation or a representation of environment that makes sense. So, the Chairo points out, we actually always imbuing concepts with meaning, right? It doesn't have inherent meaning. We give something meaning. And we define environment by the use of our individual and culturally imposed interpretive categories, and it exists as the environment the moment we give it a name and we give it some form of meaning. Therefore, the environment is not something that has reality outside of us, particularly us as humans, but it has meaning in the conceptual interactions between our physical surroundings, the social, political and economic forces that organize us in the context of these surroundings, and all of these happening within natural systems. Let me just move on. It is in this sense we say the concept is socially constructed. We give it a meaning, we make it. Okay, so a little diagrammatic representation of environment. Okay, let's take that circle as the environment. The triangle is the social or the human stuff. And at the bottom, the foundation is the biophysical or the natural world, okay? And as I've indicated here earlier, we are over-exploiting and overworking the biophysical to the point where ecological processes are being disrupted, ecosystems are being destroyed, and ecological services are under threat. Let's just take that representation and maybe insert some in the social, spread of weapons, collapse of communities, and high levels of violence, okay? Political intensifying human repression resulting from denial of government's fundamental rights. I won't read them all in detail. And there's lots of social injustice. Economic, 20% of the human race is hungry, even worse now, across Africa, and not to mention the rise in poverty. And they use the term in England, okay? The emergence of an underclass of people in England, and the decline of the middle class, which is meaning, there's something not right. And a lot of it can be laid at the door of neoliberal economic policies and globalization. And poverty, unemployment, exploitation goes with that. And the biophysical, we have pollution, ecosystem and species destruction, such a rate and such a scale that the process of organic regeneration are under threat. Sustainability is what we want to work with and work towards, because we have extinction of species and climate change and all its other human-induced climate change and all the things that go with it are sitting there. And the question is and always is, okay, we might consider that to be a crisis. Maybe, maybe not. Some people feel we're heading for a crisis. Some people feel we're there already. I'm not sure. So, okay. So whenever we have societal crises, And people often say when society itches, we scratch education. So environment-related education, can it be a response? Well, this process has been spearheaded by the United Nations, and environmental education seems to have developed in parallel to the environmental movements that started in the 60s and the 70s. So there is some form of educational response. If I just put these in a quick run, internationally, since 1975, there have been conferences which started to say, we got to look at education, okay? And in 1992, the sustainability discourses emerged from the Earth Summit in Rio. 2002, we had an Earth Summit in South Africa, where the decade of education for sustainable development was proclaimed. In the country itself, 1989, way back, a white paper on environmental education. 1995, again, environment in the curriculum, 1996, 97, and finally in 1997, in the formal curriculum, we have environmental education. And again, from there onwards, there's been a number of curriculum iterations, and where environment has been included. So I want to come and internationally, again, still look at number 4 on the top there. Quality education is one of the sustainable development goals. So education is big and central. But we want to know what kind, and I just want to quickly go into the field and just talk to 2 main things. Now, this woman, Lucy Siviwe, says that environmental education is not a form amongst many others, but it is a basic tool for environmental problem. It is not simply a basic tool. It is an essential dimension of basic education that lies at the root of personal and social development, the sphere of relationships with our environment, with our common home of life. People have different, like to say that, how we teach and what we actually do depends on how we see the environment and how we see knowledge related to environment, epistemological knowledge, and pedagogical, how we teach. And these people say environmental cognition is not just simply transfer of knowledge and information, but it's complex, right? And requires interaction and involvement with socio-economic problems. But the problem we have really is that current educational discourses doesn't allow space. Ideologically, it doesn't allow space in the way things, process-wise, in the way things play out. Because we are dominated by neoliberal education thinking in South Africa and most places of the world. Knowledge and education have been commodified. Knowledge-focused curricula where you have to learn factual knowledge all the time. They call this powerful knowledge. If you engage with that, you become a better person, which is a big myth. The focus on factual knowledge and test and examination as assessment is dominant. So this narrow view of education is very difficult to fit in complex ideas related to environment and environmental education. Are there possible ways? I just want to move on to this and go away from there and say there are different viewpoints to the narrow viewpoint. And Short says there's a thing called practical or mission-oriented knowledge. It's associated with human activities, and it says it's based on needs that arise in particular context, okay? And further, he says the practical intent or mission knowledge presupposes that the questions are generated in context and that the answers are to be found in such context, not general globalized kind of thinking, but in local settings, okay? What does that allow? It allows for leveraging of local issues and communities. And given the big global problems, local issues and problems are actually places where you can engage communities, you can engage all students, because the education we talk about is not schooling, it's all education. And so just intellectual approaches don't actually help, but working with and co-developing local knowledges is actually the key in mission and practical knowledge. And then I just want to come to a last set of points quickly. Richard Kahn developed this idea of ecopedagogies. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. I'll just run through what he says. It's derived from the work of Paulo Freire and based on critical pedagogy, critical questioning, underlying ideologies, underlying issues of power, and so on. And it opposes globalization, neoliberalism, and imperialism, and attempts to realize culturally relevant forms of knowledge, like local knowledges in local context, okay? There are three main ideas he says we should work towards, namely the technical, where basic ecological and scientific insights relevant to social life and regional bioliteracy, and of course, critical place-based literacy, questioning what's going on there where you are and trying to improve things for better, for everyone. I'll move to the next one. An extended argument quickly for ecopedagogies. It needs to be nature-based. We cannot ignore the biophysical and its crucial role, okay? And the advocating for localized change, hence the work of Short to work in local settings. Place consciousness and individual place-based identities helps with developing ecological integrity and cultural sustainability. Okay, and it promotes social and eco-justice. So, just using Jonathan's picture, maybe Richard Kahn is always arguing for an education system where we privilege and foreground the ecological. And put on the back burner, not on the back burner, but move to the second row, the social, political, or the social side of the ecological. Ecological, and then the social, and the economic needs to be in the middle. Right now, the economics in the big circle, okay? And the social-political and the ecological is the smallest. And a big problem in the perspective, and for educators, a big problem as well. So what he's saying, he says education can be utilized, can, not must, strategically through ecopedagogy to begin to adequately deal with the apocalyptic demands now being wrought upon society by the planetary ecological crisis, which I developed in the first few slides. He says further, we need to move and leverage the counter-hegemonic potential of environmental education for safe spaces. We need to work against the grand narratives, right, that are around, that are actually holding us back to respond to these problems. And he said, in doing that, a way to go, education needs to be moved beyond its discursive marginality. It's on the margins to provide real hope for an ecological and planetary society that could be sustained through widespread development of critiques and developing emancipatory life practices that move beyond the grand narratives from the culture industries and also from the state, particularly around what kinds of education work and don't work. In my last slide, maybe Richard Kahn is saying that we should work with the environment and a clear and deep understanding of what this construct means and needs at the moment. That to a dangerous construct, that's why it's read, called education, which is social processes between people, but is riddled with ideological patterns and ideological dominations and coupled to big narratives that are actually not always working in the interests of people. And that most human of activities, in a sense, through ideological mingling, can work against humans and human existence. And if we put that in a nice green box, all the field wants to do of environmental education is to help future generations and current generations to be able to think about and have the, let's call it, tools to reduce the risks and problems that face us and to strive for sustainable living practices that would put us in a much safer space than the very apocalyptic planetary space we find ourselves in now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that interesting presentation. I hope it will elicit a lot of discussions amongst us. I particularly liked the linking to the SDGs. Talking about quality education, which is SDG 4. Most people normally say that SDG, just by fulfilling that one, then it might cover all 17 of them. Because now we're talking about climate change, which is SDG 13, sure. And you are now able to link it to SDG 4, which is really very interesting. Are there any questions from online? No questions online? There are questions here?
Yeah, okay, so I'm interested in you offering up the idea that education is a solution, and I agree with you that it certainly is. But would that be sufficient to inspire people to act? So is knowledge, just simply knowledge, sufficient?
Maybe you can answer that.
Okay. No, I think I would like to present an argument that particular kinds of knowledge or knowledges and education opportunities that allow for, let me call it, active learning. It also allows for development of action competencies, which take people beyond passive learning, but understanding through interacting and then working towards action that can deal with the problem, particularly in local context. And I don't believe that knowledge actually does anything for people. That idea of powerful knowledge, I debunk that idea. You just have to work and be close to that knowledge and it will change you. Knowledge doesn't change. Education doesn't change. It provides a space for people to change. Okay.
Are there any other questions? So I hope, Prof, by education you mean both formal and
yes.
informal.
Yeah.
But my question is on the tension that exists between economic development as well as issues of environmental protection. I would say also the issue of politics.
Yeah.
Because once you start to come up with policies that are meant to address issues of environment, of course there will be people that may lose jobs, and then there might be, in terms of affect the political outcomes of elections. I think there was an example that was made yesterday, if it was not yesterday or some other day, where we would argue basically that to a certain extent, Trump was assisted, by this kind of thing, where certain states in the US, because of the coal issue and everything else, they were dependent on the coal economy. So, it did, kind of affect the outcome of the elections. So, those tensionalities, if you can just speak to them.
Yeah, I think those have been along or running parallel to fields like environment conservation, environmental education, and it's very difficult. I mean, like I was trying to say, all those, let's call it dimensions, come together. They come together in environmental issues. Let's take a local example. I mean, the offshore exploration for oil and gas of the East Coast, right? Well, it promises huge revenues through, because these are apparently very good reserves and fields. Secondly, it provides potentially many, many jobs in places where there's lots of poverty and unemployment. And working for that overused word sustainable practices is very difficult, but I can't give you an answer, but those tensions are big and they're real, between people and the environment, between people and conservation. On a smaller scale, people live in places and living in communities, and suddenly it's proclaimed a nature reserve. or someone wants to do a golf course and say they're going to give work to all the people living there. It doesn't always happen, and all other things come along with it, you know. So they're very difficult, and I think if everybody has a good perspective on the potential outcomes, right, the potential consequences, and for us, we believe that education, like, and it particularly fields like environmental education, can provide the kind of knowledge, understandings, and experiences that can help people in local spaces to make informed decisions. And that's where the field of education can still come in. Okay, did that?
Question.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question on the Yes.
As I come in.
Okay. Let me see if I can aim this far. Okay, we've got a question. How infusive and diffusive education scenario is important, especially in developing nations which are struggling for sustainability?
I didn't get the first part. Can I come and see?
Yes, fine. There you go. How important scenario of infusive and diffusive education?
Okay.
Probably how important it is,
Yeah.
especially in developing countries in order to make it a sustainable.
Oh, it's from India.
Yeah, from those two.
Well, I think I'm going to give a similar response to that I gave to the chair. The point is, we need to get people to have the understandings, to have the knowledge, the skills, maybe attitudes, and to have been part of processes to understand what the consequences can be. And if infusive and diffusive education can lead us there, then I think in developing nations, look, it's important. The big thing with developing nations, let me put it to you this way, we still have a chance. You know, in many countries, it's gone really far, you know, and it's very difficult. It will be possible to turn back the clock, if I can use that term, but we still have the opportunities to avoid some of those big disasters. So as an eternal optimist and an education person, I believe education can play a role, whether it's diffusive, infusive, hopefully not confusive, but it will get us there. Yes, in developing nations particularly. Yes.
Thank you. Any other question, Jeremiah? No other question?
There's an add-on to that.
Oh, okay.
Yes, agree that convergence and divergence need to be internalized.
I agree.
Okay. Is there any last question from the audience here? Nothing online as well? Maybe I'll just ask a very last question. I once worked at CPUT at some stage, Prof, where it was mandatory for each and every discipline to have environmental education within it. So what is your thinking, you know, in terms of that, let's say in the context of Stellenbosch?
Yep. I know in higher education institutions, people like to talk about certain core curricula and stuff that everybody needs to do. I think we need to, be able to use this word, infuse and include, I'm going to call it environment-related education in all faculties, in all schools and in all programs as best we can. Right? Environment is not for science people. Environment is not for geographers. Environment is everybody's business, and it manifests in different ways. And the knowledge and awareness and skills is for everybody to have. And therefore, I think if there's ever a core kind of a curriculum or spaces, I think I agree with you. It needs to be part of all programs and maybe part of the institution's plan, the 2030, 2050, I know where we're aiming now, 2060, I think. Sustainability is part of the. I've seen that in the text, but I think environment-related education is an important thing. Yes, I agree. And with advocate.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. I really appreciate your time, as well as your offering your thoughts and perspectives in such an important subject. Colleagues, the second speaker is Professor M.J. Boyson from the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering. I have to be careful here. I saw his profile somewhere and it says his name is not Professor, he's MJ. So I have to really be careful. MJ Boyson is Professor and Chair in the Internet of Things at the Faculty of Engineering at Stellenbosch. He has been with Stellenbosch from 2009 and his research is on the Internet of Things with a focus on smart energy, water and vehicles, specifically its application to paratransit in sub-Saharan Africa. He is also a founder of Bridge EOT. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Bridge to the Internet of Things, of course, that's what it means. And GreenX Engineering and co-creator of GISI and Counter Dropula. I'm not sure what that means. He's the director of the MTN Mobile Intelligence Lab and partner in the Stellenbosch Smart Mobile Mobility Lab. He's a senior member of the IEEE. He has worked, in various international companies, including Rolls-Royce, Boeing, BMW, and Jaguar Land Rover. He will speak to technology, social impact research, and our fight against climate change. Thank you, sir.
Is my presentation?
Yeah, yes, I put it up here for you. I'm just going to this one down. And the community does have a point if you want to make use of it. Just arrows to move your screen. Second. I'm just going to get one up here. I think you start the mouse goes in the basically you just have to click. You're good to go. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm going to take about 2 hours, so I'll try to. I'm going to speak to you about 3 things mainly that I'm very passionate about. It's really about water, energy, and transport, and specifically I'll be speaking to households and how they use electricity and water. I'll be speaking to schools and how they use electricity and water, and then I'll be speaking to paratransit, which is really minibus taxis. And what I'll try to do as I go through this is also to explain how we have used data from these sectors and how we've made that data open, speaking to maybe the theme of open access journals and open access data and how that is useful to everybody. So firstly, one of the things that I think is very important to highlight is when people think of big data and they think of data, open access data even, and sources of data, we kind of think about how often people click on your Facebook or how many times they like what you post. But in fact, one of the biggest sources of data that we're underestimating is hardware. And some of the things that we've developed at Electrical Electronic Engineering is, like the speaker said, is the Count Dropula, which is just a simple water meter, and GISI, which is a geyser controller, but it also includes quite a lot of electricity metering and water metering, and also our What's On, which is a 3-phase power meter. So the stuff that I'll talk to really goes into detail of what we've seen with these 3 devices that we've used to capture data. The first thing I want to talk to is just geysers. Now, many of you will know that the geysers is responsible for a substantial part of the household electricity usage in each one of our houses. It ranges from about 25 to, in some cases, as much as 40% of your household electricity bill. And one of the things that we set out to do was to try to reduce the amount of energy that these devices use so that we have a smaller impact on the environment, but then also obviously on everybody's pockets. But secondly, these devices draw 3 kilowatts. So in terms of your household electricity load, they are by far the biggest load in your house. And they are one of the biggest contributors to load shedding in the country as well. Our evening peak and morning peak is predominantly because of geysers. So the second thing that we aim to do was to try to reduce the load, to optimize energy, reduce the load. And then a third aspect, which is actually the primary feature of a geyser, is just to deliver hot water. So those three things draw the management strategy of the geyser in 3 different directions. And on top of it, there's a fourth factor, and just to explain what that is. The most efficient geyser out there is one that actually runs cool, in other words, one that never has to heat up. But one of the challenges with geysers is that there's a bacterium that grows in the geyser called Legionella. So the fourth thing that we needed to optimize was to ensure that there's no Legionella growing in the geyser, because otherwise people will fall ill. And basically the symptoms look like tuberculosis. So you won't even know unless you get tested whether you have Legionella or tuberculosis. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what we managed to do with substantial funding from the Water Research Council is we installed geyser controllers into many houses. I think it was about 200, 300 or so. And we measured consumption. And this consumption of hot water and electricity we measured on a minutely basis. And what that allowed us to do is firstly do a lot of interesting research, build models. As you can see, there are models at the top there, thermal models for geysers, which allows us to control it better. But it also helped us to build synthesizers. And these synthesizers, so the word synthetic is maybe negative in other fields of research, but in engineering it means something that looks like the original. So we built synthesizers, and with these synthesizers you can emulate a whole city worth of geysers so that you can do proper load management for an ESCOM. And with that, we're able to then optimize both for a city like Stellenbosch, how much electricity they draw at any particular moment, but then also reduce the energy demand of all the users, and then also ensure that it's safe and delivers hot water. Just there's a picture of some of the Legionella growth that we found in the geysers that we cut open here in Stellenbosch. We had Legionella in each and every one of them. So with this synthesizer, we can then build very interesting models. As you can see, we have a model here that models all the different aspects of a geyser. So it's a schedule controller, the power supply from the grid, we have a mixer, like a mixer tap, and then the user. And this user is the thing that essentially the synthesizer drives. And we've open accessed all that data. And the nice thing is, because we've made it open access, people from Switzerland to France to the United States to Oxford, and even now ESCOM is using this data to run simulation models for optimized geyser control. Just if you're wondering, we have 5.4 million geysers in the country, so it makes a substantial impact. And that also allows us to do different strategies of geyser management. So either you can aim to control to a high temperature, or you can aim to deliver water at exactly the right temperature so that the person is satisfied. Most geysers control to about 65 degrees Celsius, and most of us burn our skin at any temperature above 40 degrees. So there's no sense in having these hot water storage devices if all of that energy is just lost to the environment. Just for interest, this is the geyser load profile over 24 hours in South Africa, and as you can see, we have a massive morning peak when people wake up and use electricity through water heaters, and then another one in the evening. And those two peaks is responsible.
Take note that load shedding could possibly start soon.
Brilliant. That's very convenient. Yes, load shedding. So one of the other things that we're doing is to measure inside the geysers. So we've cut open a few geysers and installed sensors inside them to check what happens inside the geyser, so that we understand the stratification, and so that we could further optimize how to control these things in large-scale Internet of Things applications. Speaking about water, during the Cape Town drought of 2017-2018, we had quite a few water meters installed into households, completely coincidentally. And what this allowed us to do is to measure this natural experiment of how people responded to this natural environmental crisis. I shouldn't say natural. I guess to some extent we are to blame for it, but we could see how people responded to the drought, and very importantly, we could see whether people responded to the water restrictions, the level 1 to 4 and 5, or whether they responded to the emergency broadcasting of the politicians. And what we could clearly see, if you can see the lines there, the big change in consumption, this is a weekly liters per household, the big change in consumption happened right there. And this line here is when the disaster plan was announced. That's when government came out and said, you're going to have to queue for waters at tankers, and we're going to have the military and police guard our water supplies, as it were. And that's only when people started to respond. As you can see in the background, we also plotted the social media response to this natural disaster. And you can see when CNN and all the international outlets started mentioning the Cape Town drought in day 0, all the interest here spiked completely. But the important thing to take from this is that the smart meters and the technology allowed us to measure every single minute rather than as the municipalities did, which was every month. And the black line that I'm showing there is the municipal metering, which is just an aggregate per month. And the blue line, as I said, is our smart meter data. You can see the monthly metering misses quite a lot of the transients that's actually happening in the background. Also, another interesting thing that we were able to do is by analyzing this data temporally and just looking at when people use water and how they reduce their usage, we looked at 2 points of the drought. The first one was during the October 2017 part, and then the February 2018 part. And fundamentally, what we saw is in the first part of the drought, when it was serious, but people were not quite anxious yet, people reduced their usage in the mornings and the evenings, and the hot water and cold water both reduced. Towards the end of the drought, when it was really getting to a desperate point, and we were within a month or 2 of day 0, then only did people reduce their usage in the middle of the day. And most of the houses where we had meters installed were affluent users, which means that the people weren't even there during the middle of the day. They had domestic workers. The message that we took away from this is that in the beginning of the drought, people did not really involve the domestic workers, despite the fact that domestic work and domestic cleaning is actually a large part of water consumption in households. Then talking about one of my other passions is schools. I've got on the screen there 6 schools. These 6 schools are all within 5 kilometers of where I'm presenting from now. At the top is primary schools. The bottom is secondary schools. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, we've got quintile 5 schools. That's basically the old Model C schools. If you want to speak old South African, that'll be the white schools. I heard the previous speaker talk about white papers in 1995, so I guess I can do that. And then in the middle is what we would term the brown schools. And on the right-hand side is what would typically be, in old terms, the black schools. And what I want to show here is the property sizes, the type of infrastructure that you have. So you've got swimming pools and big buildings and hockey fields and rugby fields on the left. In the middle, you've got much less. And on the right, you've got much, much less in terms of property size and infrastructure. However, if you look at the number of learners, on the left-hand side, 600 and 700. On the right-hand side, 1,400, and this is in Kayamandi, and 1,200. I'm showing you this because I think it's important that we all acknowledge we are not nearly equal in this country. And then also because I'm going to show you some of the water and electricity usage profiles and how it relates to exactly this. Let's move on. Let me not get too political at this point. And then talking about the water. So this was also measuring water at the schools and looking at how much water the schools were using at different times of the day. And I've got at the top, it's the usage per hour for the whole school. As you can see, during any time of the day, on the left-hand side, I've got the poor schools. That's typically the black schools or the darker skin tone schools. And on the right-hand side, I've got the white schools. As you can see, the poorer schools use substantially more water than the affluent schools. And what we hypothesized at this point is that it's because water is under pressure, and that pressured water wants to come out. Whenever it finds a gap to come out, it will come out, which means that if you don't do maintenance, you're going to suffer, and you're going to suffer heavily. So we also looked at school hours and midnight hours. So firstly, During school hours, you can see the usage is substantially higher at the very poor schools, and here at the middle schools, if you want, it's lower, and at the affluent schools, it's higher. So this is mainly, we hypothesized, because the affluent schools have more infrastructure, rugby fields and swimming pools, etc. But if you look at the midnight hours, this is when no water is supposed to flow at all. You can see the poor schools still have substantial flow, and we're talking between 200 and 400 liters per minute. So this is nobody on the property. There's not supposed to be any water flowing. And if you look at the affluent schools, that's substantially less. And this speaks directly to available resources. So they don't have the resources to service their infrastructure. It also speaks to awareness. People just don't know how much their water bills are, because I don't know if you know, but the poor schools don't pay for their own bills. They send it to government, to the Western Cape Education Department, and they just pay it. They never have the feedback to see, oh, this is how much water we're using. While the rich schools are all responsible for their own expenses, which means that they are acting in a responsible way, but they also have the resources to enable them to do so. And I think this also speaks to climate change and how the feedback that the previous speakers spoke about the education aspect, just raising awareness and making people aware is a fundamentally important aspect of being environmentally responsible. But then you also have to equip and enable people to give them resources to do so. We also did the calculation for usage per learner in the school, and as you can see again, the poor schools use substantially more even per learner, not just per school. We also, during the Cape Town drought, did some interventions at schools. We spent 5,000 Rand per school. That's it. We just went in, sent a plumber in and said, just fix leaks, fix the stop valve, fix the toilets, and let's see how much we can save. And the nominal value that we found is that the savings paid off the 5,000 Rand investment within 5 weeks. And again, this is just a matter of awareness and resources. We also ran a behavioral experiment where we had 3 groups. In the one group, we shared with the group how much they used every week. Second group, we shared how much they used, but we also put them in a competition with other schools, so it was a competitive group. And then we had a third group whom we told nothing. And what was very apparent is that the group that knew nothing really struggled to manage their infrastructure, while the 2 groups that were informed on equal settings, so the competition didn't make a difference, on equal settings saved substantially more on their bills. Unfortunately, I just want to add that real quick, unfortunately, they weren't able to maintain it. So when we looked a year after, the poorer schools started to slowly drift back again, just because the infrastructure is not there. Sad aspect that I need to also mention, I don't think anything's being done about it. I received an email just before this meeting that there are schools in Khayelitsha that need speaking to about their water usage, but I mean, you can only do as much when you listen to the message, right? You have to get the tools to fix it. Then we looked at electricity. This, what you're seeing on the screen here, on the left-hand side, high schools and primary schools. This is how much electricity they use per hour of the day. 24 running hours on the left, 24 running hours on the right. The top shaded area is the quintile 5 schools. That's the more affluent schools. And the bottom shaded area is the poorer schools. What you can see is there's a marked difference. In fact, the highest using poor school doesn't even reach the lowest using affluent school in terms of kilowatt hours per hour that they use. And this is for the primary schools over here, the same thing. You've got this yawning gap of inequality facing them here. Then we compared this with other countries just to see what's going on here. As you can see, all the way from the Middle East into Europe, the usage per electricity usage per square meter is substantially higher than what it is in South Africa. So yes, part of that can be explained by the climate, just because our climate is warmer. But the other part of that is also we've got substantially less investment in infrastructure. And there's actually a lot of research showing that the higher the temperature in the classroom is, the poorer the math performance. So just saying that our climate is warm does not really address this issue. We need to provide sufficient environments for study. Then we also compared as you can see here, we compared the quintile 5 schools, that's the affluent schools, with the quintile 1 to 4 schools, and you can see the investment in those schools is even less. Many of the schools that we engaged with didn't have computer rooms, some didn't even have toilets or anything, and those things contribute to electricity usage, But obviously then the energy usage is much less. We also went to, I think we're at about 30 schools now, went into them, and with funding from the university and the Western Cape Education Department, we installed smart meters, analyzed their usage profile, and figured out that the biggest contributor, the single biggest contributor, was lighting. Lighting is one of the biggest energy eaters in schools, and we then replaced the lights at those schools with energy efficient LED lights. And what you can see here is before the intervention and after the intervention, and the colored shaded area is how much the lights contributed to their bill. At just one of these schools, the bill reduced by 37% just with changing the lights over. And at one school that we were at, one of the lights, a singular floodlight, was responsible for 7% of the electricity bill. Then a third aspect that I care deeply about, and that's also deeply ingrained in environmental management, is transport. As you're very much aware, we're moving into electric transport, and I want to be clear that electrifying transport in South Africa does not mean decarbonizing transport. Our electricity grid is so filthy and coal dependent that a transition to electric vehicles is almost on equal par or equal footing with diesel and petrol vehicles. So we investigated minibus taxis. First, again, we installed the trackers, we installed the sensors, and then we figured out how much they drive, where they drive, how fast they drive, etc. And as you can see here, this is just a count of how many taxis passed us on the N1 at Worcester on a Friday evening per half hour. You can see 166 per half hour was the peak on a Friday evening. So there's a substantial, most people don't realize this, but there's a substantial number of people going to the Eastern Cape every single weekend, take minibus taxis, they get in here 9 o'clock in the evening, and they're back on a Monday morning, 6 o'clock. And that same driver that was driving in the morning with the same vehicle has to drive that 12-hour shift all the way to Tofimvaba or wherever they're going. And then we monitored their speeds. As you can see, I'll get to the point of the environment in a second. We monitored their speeds, and the minibus taxis are not allowed to drive faster than 100 kilometers per hour. And this is the distribution of speeds that we observed, and they almost never go below 100 and mostly above 120. So there's a big safety concern there, and this is why I got involved in it. One of the aspects that we realized is that the drivers did not understand the principle of average over speed distance checking. So all that this graph is trying to show is that the speeds right next to the camera was much lower than the speeds anywhere else along the route, which means that they assumed that it was an instantaneous camera. They didn't understand average speed over distance. And that's really corroborated by the fact that in a matric test in which the teachers were tested in South Africa, only about 32% of them managed to answer the average speed over distance question correctly. So it's a bit of an awareness issue as well. What we also did is to monitor how these taxis move. I won't go into too much detail here, but essentially we found that minibus taxis move very similar to birds of prey and insects of prey, as in they move around and scurry to find passengers, and then they do a long dash to the destination, and they scurry around and then do a long dash again. It's called a Levy walk. You'll understand in a second why this is important. So the next step where it gets to the environmental thing is all the taxi data that we got. We installed trackers with funding from Mixed Telematics. All that data we made open access. And what we didn't realize at the time is because that data was available, we could then use it to assess the electrification impact. We knew exactly when the vehicles were going, at what time, how fast, and from that we could establish what the requirements would be if they were to be electrified. So we analyzed firstly how much electricity you need to get a minibus taxi moving. We assessed how often do they stand still so you can charge them, looked at the grid impact, and then also assessed based on solar simulations to what extent you can offset minibus taxi charging with solar power. And the short answer is with half a tennis court, you can cover half a taxi's daily demand on average. What is important maybe to note also, just coming back to the grid, this here is the electricity required, the dark one, the electricity required to charge an average minibus taxi if it was just running normally. And as you can see, that peak perfectly overlaps with the peak of the geysers. And in the evening as well at 7 o'clock, that peak's going to overlap. So when we have minibus taxis charging off our grid, we we won't have a grid. It's not going to survive it. Which is why we desperately need to take charging off grid and get solar installation on our charging infrastructure. What we also did is we put trackers into 6 taxis here in Stellenbosch, did 62 trips, sampled how fast they were moving, when they were moving, but now high frequency, 1 hertz. And what we found is, what we tried to establish is exactly what the energy efficiency of these vehicles would be if they were electric. One of the interesting things that we found is only 30% of the time do the taxis even stop at stop signs. So we found there were substantially fewer stops in our tracking data than there is in the maps, and the taxis don't stop, which is great for energy efficiency because they don't absorb energy and take it from the battery again, but it's horrible for safety. Now I'm moving to something completely different. One of the interesting things that we've also been working on is a water quality meter. So we're testing nitrates in water, and the way that we do this is with a cell phone camera and a UV light source and a scintillator. So nitrates absorb UV light, and if you take the UV light through the sample of water, some of it absorbs the UV light, and then into a scintillator which shifts the color spectrum from UV to green. And then with a camera in a mobile phone, take a picture of that green light. You can establish how much nitrates there is in the water, which gives you a very cheap option for water quality metering. Another thing that we're interested in now is working with the agri-science faculty, and we're building green tunnels, smart tunnels. So we're building thermal models of tunnels to allow us to better prepare, especially for climate resilience, better prepare for what plants to plant and which tunnels and how to set up the plants. And people are falling asleep, so I'm just going to jump over that real quick. We're also busy with air quality sensors. So as I said earlier, one of the things that really concern us is the schools. We found that in school classrooms, the number of children and the building materials and everything affect the temperatures in those classrooms, which means that the poorer schools also have about 5 to 10 degrees hotter classrooms, which obviously further impacts on their performance of the children. But then also, if there isn't sufficient flow of air, ventilation, then you have high levels of CO2. We're also planning to roll this out around the schools to monitor things like particulate matter and CO2 levels in the areas of the schools, because that has a negative impact on development of children and also causes stunting. I'm almost done. This is the tunnels that we're monitoring. So we're just installing these smart sensors to allow us to monitor the plant growth and also the CO2 levels and everything. And these are some of the plants that we're evaluating with the Agri-Tech faculty, looking at climate resilient Bambara nuts. Bambara nuts, it's a legume, it's not a nut, but it is extremely climate resilient. One of the weird things that we're starting to see is that the roots seem to love high temperatures. So even if the temperature of the water is above 40, where it burns your skin, the roots are flourishing. And we're trying to understand how that works and trying to measure exactly what the temperatures are in there. And I think that may just be it. Yeah, that is me done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Boyson. I'm not even sure if I want to comment. There are so many, interesting points that you made here. But I think it actually speaks to research for impact that Stellenbosch University is talking about. You go to these areas, for example, on community engagement assignments, and then you see problems, you try to solve those problems, which is a good thing. And then you make the data, you give the data back to the community by making it open access, which would, ultimately help the society. Colleagues, are there any questions for Prof. Boyson? Yes, sir.
One simple question, actually. Do you think a reduction in water use can subsequently result in a reduction in energy use? For example, shorter showering times?
Absolutely. If you So for the people online, just so you know what was asked, the question was whether the change in behavior in water has an impact on energy. We actually assessed, there's a very nice paper, if you go to my website and have a look, there's a nice paper where we evaluated all the different things you can do to save energy. And one of the top 3 is actually just using less water. Every single liter that you use less has a concomitant reaction in terms of the amount of energy that you use. So if you open up the shower and you let it run for a few minutes and you get in, every one of those liters has, I almost want to say, sacred energy stored in it that we're just wasting. So absolutely, the best thing you can do is to switch off your geyser before you start using water. The second best thing you can do is to try to place your geyser such that the inlet temperature of the water is higher, because that makes a big difference. And the third best thing you can do is just use less water. Absolutely.
Okay. Any questions online from people online? Dr. Chuma?
Just one quick one. You mentioned that material which is found in geysers. What is the impact of that material on human health? Do you have an idea about?
Impact of material?
Yeah, the bacteria that you mentioned.
Oh, bacteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good one. So I really don't want to fearmonger, and I don't think it's necessary to do so. But I can't remember exactly how many geysers we cut open. I know we did 5, and then I think about 5 more. Every single one of them had Legionella in them, and it was sufficient to sustain a community of Legionella. The issue that we have in South Africa, many people turn off their geysers in the middle of the day, or they turn down the temperatures to save money, because we have a lot of poor people in the country. In those geysers, because the temperature doesn't ever go high enough, Legionella grows. It flourishes, in fact. Okay, so sorry, that's a long answer to get to where I'm going to. When the Legionella gets beyond a certain level of parts per million, basically, then if you inhale it, you could die. There's Legionella pneumophila, and we found that in all the geysers. If you inhale it, you'll die. So basically, if you sit in the shower and you breathe in while you're showering, then you could potentially die. But it has to be above a certain threshold. And we didn't test in geysers that wasn't set to high temperatures, so we don't really know how high it could go. But it could go high. But that's another factor that plays into it, is how well the water is treated. So that Legionella needs to come from somewhere. It actually comes into the inlet, but at very low levels, and then it grows. The problem is, sorry, I'm answering a long answer here. The geyser stratifies. The hot water goes to the top, the cold water to the bottom. What we found is that bottom, almost this much of your geyser, never gets hot, unless you really turn up the temperature and keep it very high. It stays at about 25, 35, maybe 40 degrees. That's perfect growth for Legionella, perfect temperature for it. In many countries abroad, they actually have legislation that you can't go over 55 or 60 to protect people against Legionella. I personally think, and I have no evidence for it, I actually think many people that we think have tuberculosis may actually have Legionella, but I have nothing to base that on. It's just a feeling, yeah. I'm not sure if that answers your questions.
Another question you can take, sir?
You eliminate the community from the water use in the poor community. Normally, the communities around also share the spaces with the school. So you might find this higher as
Absolutely. Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. One of the big things that we're trying to address now is many, and I'm sorry to be so crass about this, but many white people don't even know this. Most of the schools in the country actually have feeding schemes. They provide food to the children, which is also a very big impact. And then, like you say, many people don't have water on their property. So it's easy to just get onto the school property and use the water and not close the taps often. And many of these schools become community centers over weekends as well. But the problem is who pays for that water, who looks after the water. There's a responsibility, there's a broken feedback loop there. But sorry, what I also wanted to say is that all those cooking and feeding schemes at the schools, sometimes they actually use wood fires to cook, and all that pollution then ends up inside the building. So there's a lot of work to still do there. So one of the projects we're just starting now is a clean cooking project where we're looking at maybe replacing that with pressure cookers.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was actually a good question. You are reminding me now that other schools, there are churches,
Exactly.
on Sundays, there's a lot of churches that go in there. But yeah, thank you so much, Prof, for enlightening us. When are you going to be the CEO of ESCOM? Yeah, I think we are actually looking for people with the kind of thinking that you have in such organizations to solve some of the societal problems. Next up will be Dr. Chuma. Dr. Chuma, I didn't get your profile. You are the postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Agronomy, and you will speak to ecological intensification as a pathway to sustainable agriculture in drylands. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, all. I'm from the Department of Agronomy, and I'll try to explain our impact from agronomy, from agriculture, the impact of agriculture in climate change, its role also. I think as highlighted, knowledge is quite vital if we are going to try and reduce our impact on the environment, but it goes beyond having knowledge. We now need to act upon our knowledge so that we can have now an impactful results which are favorable to our betterment of our planet. So this is going to be in agriculture in general, not necessarily only in drylands. So when we say drylands, we're talking about where irrigation is not involved, but I'm just going to speak broadly referring to agriculture. So human activities have contributed immensely in the greenhouse gas emissions. So in this case here, I'm referring mostly to agriculture activities. So there is a need for us to increase our crop production. We need to increase food production. So by so doing, what do? We turn the soil, and most importantly, as we turn the soil, we release the carbon which is stored in the soil, and then it goes to the atmosphere as greenhouse gas, contributing to global warming. But that's not the only thing. Before we turn the soil, one thing that we do is we destroy the forests. And now it's a twofold thing which I've already mentioned here. By cutting down the trees and other green plants, they are responsible for absorbing carbon dioxide, removing it from the atmosphere. So one, in agriculture, we chop down the trees, so there's nothing which is going to remove the carbon dioxide. Two, we turn the soil as we till. So now we're removing the carbon dioxide, which is already stored in the soil. It goes again up in the atmosphere. So yes, in agriculture, there is a lot that we do contributing to global warming and climate change. So having that knowledge only, we can take it a step further and also talk about nitrogen fertilizers use. It's no secret that with the discovery of nitrogen, or synthetic fertilizers, should I say, there's been a huge increase in food production ever since the 1950s. They refer to it as the Green Revolution. Food production increased because of the use of nitrogen fertilizers. But what has been happening also with nitrogen fertilizer, if I can look at the life cycle analysis of nitrogen, starting from the factory, we burn a lot of, we use a lot of electricity, contributes with greenhouse gases. And then from there, the fertilizer is packaged, transported from the manufacturing factories to the stores the stores which are going to sell them now to the farmers. And then from there, they're going to be transferred from the stores all the way to the farms. And in the farms, they are going to be transferred using tractors to distribute, to spread them on the farm. We're using, it's a carbon footprint which goes on from the manufacturing all the way until the fertilizer is in the soil. But now, how does fertilizer work? I can use an example which comes to my mind right now, which is alcohol, for example. When you are new to alcohol, you might take maybe one glass, get you high. But tomorrow and the day after, you now need not one, but 2 or 3 and 4. So that's the same thing also with these synthetic fertilizers that we have. So we might start by using a small quantity, which is going to give us a huge yield. But as the years go on and on, we now need to increase the amount of fertilizer that we put in order to get the same yield. And therefore, we're putting pressure on the manufacturing industries to manufacture more. So this is what has been happening with the trend in fertilizer use. Ever since the green revolutions in the 1950s, the fertilizer use has been increasing. Of course, in Africa, our use is relatively low compared to the rest of the world. But if you look at the picture, which is an inset, which is on top there, it shows now the global trend, starting off with something like 10 million tons of fertilizer. Around 2020, it's now times 10 what we've been using. So come to think of it, we're chopping down trees, we're turning the soil, we're applying fertilizer, we're contributing to climate change. So then what can we do in order for us? We have this knowledge now. What can we do with this knowledge in order for us to reduce our impact on the environment? One possible way would be to look at what we refer to as ecological intensification. I think one of the speakers have already mentioned something about ecology. We're talking about the ecosystem. We're using our ecosystem to our advantage in order to mitigate our impact on climate change. So ecological intensification simply refers to the enhancement of ecosystem services to complement or to substitute for the use of synthetic inputs to maintain or to increase our yield. So in a nutshell, when we talk about ecological intensification, we're talking about, instead of using synthetic fertilizers, why don't we use what we already have, the manure? We can also use nitrogen fixing plants, the legumes. The Prof has already mentioned about one, the Bambara groundnut. It's also a legume, can fix nitrogen in the roots. We can also use a variety of crops. We call that something like intercropping and crop rotation. They're also beneficial for improving our crop yields without putting a lot of synthetic fertilizers. So the talk which I'm presenting to you is a recent article, comes from a recent article that we looked at across different countries. We looked at long-term trials which ran for at least 10 years going forward in order for us to have a clear picture of the trend or the impacts of agriculture on our environment. So going back to the picture which I've shown you, the global use of synthetic fertilizers and all these other nitty-gritties which I've already highlighted, the negative impacts of agriculture on the environment. Now imagine you've put all this fertilizer and then we have, due to climate change, some events as more water, more rainfall than what we anticipated. In fact, I think the issue of flooding has been in the news, or it is still in the news, with Nigeria, currently Nigeria and Cameroon experiencing heavy floods. A lot of people, I think in Nigeria, they're saying at least 600 people dead and millions homeless. And before that, it was Pakistani, also thousands of people killed. We can talk about here KZN, we can talk about the Western Cape droughts, the Eastern Cape droughts as well, all being related to climate change. But I'm not saying here agriculture is the sole to blame. I think we have our fair share in contributing to that. So in addition to climate change or global warming, we're saying if this fertilizer is going to be washed away and then it goes into our waterways, we're now creating another problem again. We have eutrophication, which is going to lead to the death of our aquatic animals, all coming from agriculture. So we definitely need to mitigate or reduce the use of our synthetic chemicals in our fields. This article had 24 authors across the globe, and of which 5 of us are from the Department of Agronomy. And it involved 30 long-term trials. And as I've already mentioned, each of the trials was 10 years and above for us to generate the information that we did. And we looked at more than 25,000 yield records. The trials, some of them are here in South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, all the way to the Netherlands. And in South Africa, we looked at the trials here in the Western Cape, of which 3 of them were in the Swartland, and then 2 of the long-term trials are in Tagarug in the Southern Cape. We looked at different crops. We looked at maize, we looked at oats, we looked at wheat, potatoes, sugar beet, and barley. And for the trials in South Africa, all of them involved wheat, which is one thing that we are trying to increase the yield, and we don't have enough of it, unfortunately. We looked at different farming systems. We looked at monoculture, the production of one crop season after season. We looked at crop rotations, whether the crop rotations have or do not have legumes. We looked at grazing, the impact of grazing, the involvement of animals. Or in South Africa, the long-term trials that we use have sheep as part of the program. We looked at fertilizer use, where we compared the fields which do not have any fertilizer application compared to others which have got more than 100 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer per hectare. And then we also looked at the use of manure. It can be animal manure, or we used plant-based, and we looked at systems which did not incorporate any of this. We also looked at other aspects, such as the crop residue management, whether we cut and remove the crop residues or we leave it there in the farm. It also has an impact on our soil. We looked at different tillage methods, whereby we looked at deep conventional tillage using the moldball plow, which turns the soil, leaves the ground bare, clean, but we have already highlighted the impact of that. It removes all the carbon, most of the carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. So we compare that one there with no-till, whereby you only make some small cuttings on the soil just to drop the seeds and no further disturbance to the soil, which greatly helps with our carbon sequestration. So I'm not going to bother ourselves with data analysis, but one thing that I've just highlighted, that our trials involved different spans, some just above 10 and some way over 40 years, like one that we have in the Swartland is now 45 years old, and the trial is still going. So the most important thing out of this are the findings. We know that fertilizer contributes, yes, it increases food production, that's true, but we know again the negative impact on it. So yes, we do get high crop yields with fertilizer, but now we are saying the high crop yields that we usually obtain when we use synthetic fertilizers, we can still obtain those high yields using a combination of environmentally friendly practices, such as what? The use of legumes, the use of manure. So we can still get the same yields. So with that one there, we need to weigh, is it really necessary for us to keep on applying a lot of fertilizer, or we can use what we already have to help with preserving our planet? Of course, we don't get much benefits if we use a combination of high fertilizers and then using a lot of the legumes. The two don't work together. It's either you sacrifice one in order for you to achieve full benefit, and which one can we sacrifice? In this case around, we have to sacrifice on the synthetic fertilizer because that can only be better for our environment. We also get small yield benefits where we have high nitrogen fertilizer in combination with manure. So again, if we add manure and fertilizer both in high quantities, we don't get that benefit. So we need to reduce one. And so which one can we reduce in order for bettering our planet? We can cut on the fertilizer and we still get all the benefits that we intend, that we want in terms of food production, as well as the sustainability of our farming. High nitrogen fertilizer and diversification with non-legumes led to improved yields. Yes. Suppose one does not have legumes, you can still use a variety of other crops which can be beneficial. But remember, one of the culprits that we have is the fertilizer. So it will be beneficial for us rather to stick to what I've already mentioned, reduce the amount of fertilizer and stick to the use of legumes, nitrogen fixing legumes, and crop diversification. I think in a nutshell, that's the most important thing that we wanted to highlight here. And another thing now concerning overall effect of keeping residues. Yes, in terms of yield, we did not find any improvement in yield production with the cover crops. But of course, there is improvement in soil quality. The soil itself is full of microorganisms. So if we leave some crop residues on top, it helps with building our soil microbes, which improves soil quality. It's beneficial. I also mentioned something about comparing tillage practices, whereby we looked at deep tillage, which involves turning the soil upside down, which contributes to a lot of carbon dioxide being released. We compare that with no-till. We wanted to see how much yield is going to be affected. And of course, we noted that our yield was not significantly reduced or increased. So now taking the two, one farmer tills the soil, the other one does not till, but at the end of the day, you still get equal amount of harvest. Which one will make an economic sense? Of course, the moment you start tilling, you're going to burn a lot of fuel in order for you to till the soil. That's more money for you as a farmer, which is going down the drain. And that's also bad for the environment, whereas there is an alternative that we can use by reducing tillage. So if a farmer can have all this knowledge, it will be up now for the farmer to decide which one of these ecological practices which might be suitable for the environment. If you have the capability to grow cover crops, green manures, legumes, then it seems worth a while going that way. If you have cattle already on your farm, which are producing a lot of manure, why not take that and apply it in the field? In that way, we help with reducing our impact on climate. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chuma, for such an interesting study. Again, that has potential to contribute to the well-being of the people, basically. So, without much ado, are there any questions?
Thanks for the talk. I read that paper and congratulations, it's a really great paper. The question I have is, can you supply organic materials to scale as needed for the sort of kind of large-scale production of food? I mean, or do we have to kind of change the way we think about it to be able to supply them? Because at the moment, fertilizers are readily available. You can go down and purchase them from the local store.
I think that's one thing that we need to work on. Organic fertilizers are something which are quite still expensive, but the moment we start focusing on fertilizers and then we look at what is happening in Russia, it's affecting a whole lot of that. That is where most of the fertilizers are produced and then maybe transported to other parts of the country. So if we're not able to look into alternative fertilizer sources, then in the long run it's going to affect the global food production system. So it's high time we start investing in something that we can have. Maybe we can try going at looking at green manures, the legumes. I'm sure all of us, or as farmers, we have that possibility of farming legumes instead of solely relying on synthetic fertilizers. But yes, we still need those synthetic fertilizers in the short run, in the long run. They're beneficial, it's true, but we don't want to keep on adding year after year, increasing the amount of fertilizer that we're using. So it's high time now. So the events in Russia can say, well, I open us to say, hey, we need to start looking elsewhere for sources of nitrogen fertilizers for our plants.
So I just want to curious how open are farmers to farming practices to more sustainable methods, and is there a way that you inform people how do they become aware of these practices?
Some farmers are really interested in change, but some are more interested in the tradition and how they've inherited their farms, how things have been going on in their farms, and they want to maintain it that way. I'll speak, for example, with what I refer to as tillage. We find that in South Africa, since the 1980s or so, a lot of farms have stopped using those huge multiple plows which turn the soil. For that reason, people have changed. For that reason, you find that back then, before that, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a law which said all farms which are on stock, they must have ridges or contours to try and keep soil, because the soil will be loose. But now, because people have shifted from using the moldboards, which loosen the soil, they are now using no-till or zero-till methods. The soil has become firm again. It's able now to hold all the carbon which it can hold. soil erosion has been reduced. So that law has been relaxed. So some farmers are already destroying those contours. So yes, some people, majority are open to change, but you find a few who still want to stick to their ways of farming.
Oh, there is an online question, Doc.
Yes, there's on our question, nature-based solutions are nature-friendly, but the crops might have limited yield. How sustainable is it for sufficient availability of food, and how the trade-off can we manage?
Yes, that's a very beautiful question, but as I've already mentioned from the trial that we did not say, we are not saying stop using fertilizers. The message is we want to reduce the synthetic fertilizers that we're using. Yes, we can still use in combination with the other fertilizers, that are the natural ones that we have. Because if we were to say right now, stop using fertilizer, the synthetic fertilizers, only use legumes and cattle manure, some people don't even have don't even have a cattle on their farms. So where are they going to get that source of fertilizers? It's impossible. But if you have it, then why not use it? Why not utilize it? Because it's been proven, it's beneficial. So going forward, the aim here is to try and produce as much food as we want, as we need, but at the same time also considering the aspect of our planet. So we need to reduce the amount of fertilizer that we're using.
Okay, perhaps we should tax synthetic fertilizer to subsidize, organic fertilizer, so that it's a bit cheaper, because you're saying it's expensive. So perhaps we should look into those solutions. Thank you so much, Dr. Chuma, for such an interesting presentation, and also for your time to come and share your knowledge with us here. Next, we'll have. Sorry, I'm just now checking on my computer. Professor Karen Esler. Am I pronouncing you right? She is the head of the Department of Conservation, Ecology, and Entomology at Stellenbosch University. She has been a core member of the DSET NRF Center of Excellence for Invasion Biology since its inception in 2004, and currently serves as an African Associate Editor for the journal Conservation Biology. She will speak to connectedness and reciprocity with nature, a personal tale in pursuit of well-being. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the audience in presence and also online. I hope I make it worthwhile for you to listen to me on a Friday afternoon. I'm sure there are many other things you'd rather be doing. So, yes, just get the slides up. Great.
I just want to show you at the bottom, if you can, please.
Laser pointer is great, yeah. Okay.
But then you have to use that, just move your slides.
Okay, just this one.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So what's all of this about? I'm going to start off by talking about what the Intergovernmental Panel it's the platform for policy and intergovernmental science policy for people and nature. And this is a large-scale global initiative trying to really drill down to try and understand what it will take to effectively address climate change and global change challenges, particularly in the sort of biodiversity environment. And I was privileged to be involved in the global assessment as a review editor. This is one of the papers that I'm going to talk about that came out of that global assessment. And essentially what this panel did was identify what they call priority points for intervention, or leverage points, and overarching actions or levers, which that could have a substantial effect on addressing these global change challenges. And so this is a figure of those leverage points and levers. And essentially, there are a couple of things I want to say about this figure. The one is that when I was training in a conservation environment or ecological environment, I was focused mostly on the planet and understanding what the organisms were doing. So that was my training. But essentially, over time, it became very clear to me that that's not really where I'm going to make a big difference. Understanding the ecological makeup and the way that the dynamics of an ecosystem work is great, but it's not going to address these kinds of challenges alone. And what is going to address those challenges is a combination of the levers and the leverage points, the intervention points that are going to make a big difference. So the levers are multi-actor interventions, and I want to point out two leverage points that were identified in this particular scheme. One, embrace diverse visions of a good life. Strange one, maybe, to some. And then the other one, unleash latent values of responsibility to enable widespread action. So what does that mean? The question is, how do we embrace visions of a good life? And how do we unleash latent values of responsibility to enable widespread action in order to actually essentially start speeding up a positive feedback loop? So the more we feel, maybe we feel better, the more we have, there's healthy actions and it's a positive feedback, that kind of thing. Well, the literature actually in a variety of different sectors actually calls for this idea of reconnecting people with nature. And particularly in my own environment, which is conservation, that's a very strong call. And Richard Cowling, who was my PhD supervisor and a great mentor and a friend, this is one of a statement that came out of one of his papers saying that even if all the other building blocks for effective conservation are in place, we won't succeed unless the general public cares, and they're unlikely to care unless they no longer experience nature directly. So if nature is completely disconnected, they're not likely to care very much. So how do we do that? How do we achieve connectedness? Well, enter a PhD student. This PhD student came in around sort of 2000s, Matt Zelstra. And Matt was interested in this idea of connectedness with nature. And so we went boldly where few others had gone before. And he was one of the first of a transdisciplinary PhD idea and co-supervised by the co-authors on that paper that you see there. And you can actually find his PhD in the Sun Scholar Research Repository if you want to go and have a look. He defined in his PhD that connectedness with nature is a stable state of consciousness comprising symbiotic, cognitive, affective, and experiential traits that reflect through consistent attitudes and behaviors a sustained awareness of the interrelatedness between oneself and the rest of nature. It's kind of a mouthful, but what you can take away from that is a stable state of consciousness, sustained behavior, and between this interaction between self and nature. And in that paper, there's a framework of how this can be achieved. So if you start with the red arrow and move around sort of from the bottom and up to the top, it kind of gets to the question I was asking Professor Reddy at the beginning about it's not really enough to necessarily, I mean, it's great to know about nature and to know more, but it's not going to necessarily end up in action. So we can appreciate nature, but we don't necessarily, we still might throw our litter, plastic litter, or buy stuff that's environmentally unfriendly or whatever. Through some sort of structured, purposeful, and time-constrained activities, we might experience nature a bit, so feel better in the process of experiencing nature, but still we might not necessarily be enlivened enough to sufficiently behave or to react for nature. And so we identified this idea of mostly unstructured, or matter essentially, the unstructured, playful, creative, timeless activities that might end up inducing connectedness with nature. Now, this is a scheme, this is a theoretical scheme, and what does this really mean? And it really didn't, I mean, I guess I understood this from an academic point of view, but to really understand this, you've actually got to kind of experience it yourself, and this is the personal story that I want to tell you about that. So this idea of reciprocity, so be able to behave in a way in which you actually are giving back to the environment. How do we do this? how do we enhance connectedness? And I'm going to actually move that through in a personal story now. So, so with that scheme in mind, so I'm going to start off at a point. I mean, this happens, my connectedness or my behavior as an academic probably goes back to when I was educated as a kid and also went to museum clubs and so on. So I was very much engaged with nature. But I'm going to start the story at a point, and this is at a point in my life which is quite a significant time because it really changed a lot of things. So I got involved in this really interesting project, which was trying to imagine what the world was like 165,000 years ago when our species went through quite a significant bottleneck and small populations remained behind, and they existed in this landscape, in the Southern Cape landscape, and Cape is sort of kind of the Eden for our species. And we were interested in a range of different things, and a multidisciplinary group of people came together. And my sort of task in that group was to figure out something around the resources that were potentially available. So we used proxies of today's habitats to look at what was available for diet in the past. There was a marine component, and I was a terrestrial with a bunch of PhD students and collaborate in a collaborative environment. And so that got me started thinking a lot about diet in my own sense. And around about that time, I was we had workshops. About 2012, it was a very significant workshop, and a prominent doctor was present at that workshop. And over the course of the weekend, he spoke to me, and he convinced me, because he was actually looking at me. I was really suffering at that stage from a whole range of autoimmune challenges. So one of my friends said, Karen never makes a rash decision, she always makes a decision with a rash. So I was really suffering from these autoimmune challenges. And this doctor convinced me that perhaps maybe I should start thinking about my own diet a little bit. And around about that time too, my husband and I, who I have to say is he essentially is in the garden pretty much every day. He is the gardener in our household, and he's responsible for growing all the food. But we started a garden. We started a vegetable garden. So you can see the one side, and it's about 10-year gap between that. And in the process of this vegetable garden, we started learning a lot of interesting things about what grew, what didn't grow, how to save on resources, water, and so on. Essentially, we built the soil, and we started learning a lot about the benefits of this. But those kinds of benefits, sure, they were great, and I will tell you a little bit more about those benefits. But the ones that I really want to talk to you about are some interesting ones. It's some ones that came out from nowhere for me. At a certain stage in this process, I hit a time in my life which was extremely challenging. I went through a significant loss, extreme shock because household was invaded. It was a significant and hard time, and I was finding it very, very hard to manage that grief, that stress, and what that was going on. And I found myself going into the garden a lot more. And that was the thing that was actually making me feel better, was when I went and I was focusing in, it was a timeless activity. I was focusing in on the beauty of this vegetable garden. And I started taking photographs of the vegetables, and weirdly, it started making me feel a lot better. What's going on? So I actually, in fact, inadvertently invented my own sort of meditation tool in the process. So I started taking photographs, and then I actually started arranging the vegetables that we grew into mandalas. And I'll tell you a little bit about a mandala in a second. But essentially, that whole process ended up, for me, it was an interesting healing process for myself, but also in the process of doing that, there was a feedback to biodiversity and all sorts of other interesting things. So that's a personal story, and now I want to tell you a little bit about what the literature is saying about this connectedness with nature and also home gardening as well as being kind of an interesting into quite an interesting world, I think. So in terms of reducing the food's environmental impact, this is a paper by Poor et al. In Science, published in 2018, and essentially they argue, they say that if you look at all the emissions, about a quarter of global emissions come from food, and of that quarter, half of that is food's emissions that come from animal products, and of that half, half of it comes from lamb and beef. So essentially, by just simply adjusting our diets a little bit, we could potentially be making a difference to the global emissions. And these authors actually put together a graphical representation of the mitigation framework, which actually goes from farm-based, what we heard earlier, actions that can happen at a farm level to reduce inputs and so on, right to consumers. And what I ask is the question is, what are the benefits of adjusting or thinking about household or community food gardens in this scheme? So it doesn't really actually enter into the scheme too much yet, and I think it should. So home gardening is promoted as an adaptation strategy to ameliorate climate change impacts on food security. It's come up in this paper. This is a paper, it's one of the few that I could find that really sort of looked at home gardening in an African situation, and essentially it shows that the arrows, upward arrows next to that, are indicating improvements. So at a household level, mothers, children, we can actually improve food security, we can actually increase or improve diet quality and nutritional status. Of course, there are multiple barriers associated with the home gardening, and these are things, some of these things we can actually start to address. There are policy actions in place that we could start to think about in terms of scaling this kind of thing up. There also is quite a bit of a literature that links it to urban green infrastructure and food gardens in urban situations. And there are multiple physical and experience-based benefits that can be derived from urban gardens. And so it's addressed, this is actually put forward as quite a salient approach to address climate change adaptation in cities. And yet, when you start looking at the policies in cities, and the only analysis that I could find was a North American one, you don't see that this is actually entering in. I mean, it's the sort of food gardening aspect of it is not as well supported as it could be in the policy framing of any urban design. And again, perhaps maybe an opportunity in African situations. I think we're going to have we're going to have a couple of the world's top 10 largest cities on this continent soon. So we can start thinking about these things significantly. Now, if we just think about plant-based diets, this scheme over here is a result of a series of very large-scale trials involving huge numbers of health service folks in 3 different trials, and they're different colors, so that they're different colors. And essentially, they were followed weight changes. This is just weight over time, weight changes in relation to food or diets of those people. And what you can see very clearly here is, so the line on this side, it's all positive weight gain. On this side, negative. I mean, if you're close to the line, that's okay, you're a stable state. But if you have a look at that, most of the things, dietary diet, are plant-based in this thing, that are actually the scheme, that are benefiting people in terms of weight loss, if that's the case, that you want to lose weight. It turns out, I mean, plants have a huge number of other benefits. You know, the polyphenol compounds in plants. There are studies which have demonstrate that these polyphenols are really a good defense against a whole range of human diseases. So actually, there are benefits to us from eating plant-based diets or increasing plants in our diets. So the question I really want to get is this, what is it, those are all sort of physical benefits of plants, of home gardens. But what about this question? So just a little bit about what I did, or maybe I should maybe I'll get into it. I'll tell you a little bit more down the line about that. So it's really around this enlivening, this playful, unstructured activity that ended up making a really big difference in my own life, and I think actually enhanced this connectedness idea. So what is mindfulness? Because essentially that was what I was doing. I was actually focusing in and centering myself, and thereby overcoming this terrible grief that I was experiencing. So meditation and mindfulness are related, but they're not the same thing. Meditation is when you're sort of going inwards. Mindfulness can be something about, acting mindfully outwards. But there's a whole sort of science around mindfulness meditation, which is around, there's an academic definition, but essentially this unstructured, playful, creative, timeless activity would fall within this idea of mindfulness meditation. And there's a wonderful author, Amishi Jha. She says essentially it's paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And a variety of different subdisciplines are actually starting to think about mindfulness meditation in terms of education. So, for example, instead of sending children to detention, sending them into meditative processes, and apparently it appears to improve behavior of children and so on. So there's an interesting paradigm shift that sort of started going, certainly in Western science, because these tools have been known to the East for millennia. And so essentially this idea that mental activity can actually change the physical brain structure, your own brain, and influence well-being and resilience. Really, really interesting. The longer you do it, the better it becomes. So I've been doing this now for 3 years, and I do it on a weekly basis, and I post all of those mandalas on, and that I'll explain in a little while. And so there's this emerging evidence that actually what I was doing might have actually had a real physical effect on my own cognitive behavior. So mandalas as meditation tools, that's one way of inducing this meditation state, unstructured, playful, creative, timeless activity. Mandala means circle in Sanskrit. It originated in the 4th century. It's really associated with Eastern religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and so on. And it has roots in spiritual practices to attain mindfulness and to get into that good state. So it's essentially you focus from the outer into the inner core, and in doing so, you calm yourself. And Carl Jung is credited mostly for bringing mandalas to the West. He visited India in the 1930s, and he brought this idea of mandalas across into, and it's become kind of almost, you'll see them in coloring books nowadays. So my version was a vegetable mandala. And essentially what it does, I go in and I harvest on a daily basis in our garden now. So most of what we eat as a household now, everything from 5 to 100% of any meal might come from the vegetable garden. But the process of just going out into that garden and spending time is a really good thing. I do that on a daily basis, and on every week or so, I spend a little bit of time and just calm myself down, and I make these mandalas. The mandalas take between 5 and 15 minutes, and then I take the food and I put it into a pot and we eat it for supper. Yes, I've been doing this for the past 3 years. And the benefits of this have been amazing because it's given me peace, it's calmed me down, it's provided a method for me to be in the moment, and it's generated a huge amount of gratitude in the process. And that is a consequence of meditation. It is a positive benefit of meditation. And there are also social connections that develop. I mean, for example, I now follow a bunch of other people doing similar things in other parts of the world with nature, art and nature. And also there's a social connection, being able to give something to somebody else, because the garden, nothing should be wasted. You give and you gift, and there's also benefit in that. So interestingly enough, if you Google mindfulness, and I challenge you to do that, if you have a look at those pictures, this is my Google, and it's a screen capture. I just typed in mindfulness, and I just screen captured all the pictures that came up when I did that. And if you have a look at that, the one thing that's pretty much in common with all those pictures, even though I didn't say nature is right there. So Google knows the answer. Google knows that by getting back into nature, we're actually, we're going to be able to actually achieve these things that we need to do in our lives, certainly if you're in a very high-stressed environment. So there is nature nurtures, and it's actually, there's some very prominent writers that have said that, that it's to be expected. We have an innate tendency to connect with nature. It's just that we've disconnected ourselves by, going into cities, no longer having gardens, living in high-rise flats or whatever it is. There are different theories out there as to how we benefit from nature. Some say that it's actually cognitive restoration that's going on. So, that being in a natural environment restores your cognition. And others say that it actually decreases negative emotions, and it's related to recovery of stress. In fact, actually, it's probably both. So time in nature can not only improve working memory. So what I was doing was actually increasing my productivity at work. I mean, that's incredible if you think about it. So just actually taking time out to be on my own, center myself with a little bit of time, helped me to improve my own cognitive working capacity. I think that's really cool. And also, obviously, reducing stress and inducing gratitude. And there are physiological assessments that actually back all of this up, related to heart rate, blood pressure, lowering cortisol, and so on. There are also neural underpinnings, and this is what I find really interesting. Although I'm not a neurobiologist, I thought this was very interesting. One of the gaps, though, is that we don't really know how context might change, because most of the work that I picked up is North American and European. And so if we really want to actually figure out how this is actually going to work in our context, we need to start doing the work more locally. So here's a really interesting paper that I picked up, and it's actually just early online at the moment. It's in molecular psychiatry. So the amygdala is apparently an area of the brain in which indicates stress responses sometimes. So if you're more stressed, the more lit up the amygdala is. It's also the part of the brain that's important for memory and decision making. So you can kind of see that these two are related, that you can increase productivity by influencing your brain. So what they did was they actually took a group of people and they administered questionnaires, and then they sent them to walk in the natural environment and the urban environment. And then they re-imaged their brains and reassessed, gave these people questionnaires. Now, I'm going to try and explain this to you quickly, but essentially they had different kinds of conditions which enabled them to really understand whether or not it was the absence of urban effect or being in nature that was the effect that was shown. So they actually were looking at the amygdala, which is this little patch here on the brain. And if we have a look at both of these sides, they're pretty much saying the same thing. The gray is the urban walkers, and the green are the forest walkers. And essentially, in both cases, and I won't go into this fearful and neutral phases, you can read the paper if you want to know more about that. What you can see is the amygdala activity declines significantly. And essentially, they concluded in this paper that nature restores individuals from stress. There's also an association between gratitude and life satisfaction, and also that they're now picking up that this is linked through there's neuroscientific evidence for this through the connection of the brain. And if I want to just talk about gratitude, it's a state of wonder, thankfulness, appreciation for life that enhances or gets us going and doing things. And yeah, it tends to be that grateful people have a more satisfactory life. It broadens thoughts, it builds personal and social resources, and leads to a promotion of well-being. So, these authors, actually, even if they're corrected for personality traits, were able to determine that there is a structural, brain-predicted sort of link between life satisfaction and gratitude. Really interesting. So this gets me back to this idea of reciprocity and connectedness, and something that if we're going to be able to enhance or unleash those good visions of a life that is good, and also actually get people to do things, to actually change behavior sufficiently that we can change the world. Essentially, we've got to be able to try and get to this reciprocity. It appears that engaging with nature is one way of really getting this achieved. It turns out that actually, this is a survey, result of a survey. It's not really, this is a largely white population, more than US-based, more than 4,000 surveys. And it was interesting that people were 20 times more likely just to mention, I appreciate nature, relative to actually, I'm going to do something, because I appreciate nature, I'm going to do something about it. So essentially, this paper concluded we need to intervene somehow. We can't just, people can appreciate, we can give them the knowledge and they can appreciate that they're getting gifts from nature, but we actually need to do more to be able to actually get that reciprocity. So this is where this mandala idea, and it's linked into a sort of a broader idea. It's not, I'm not saying anybody must go and rush up and make vegetable mandalas. That's my own interpretation of it. But there are a bunch of different and interesting feedbacks that happen for me. And personally, the sustained practice meant that I have sustained time in nature. It improved my health significantly so, and that's another story. It has saved us money. It is an artistic outlet. It did certainly allow me to overcome my own stress and grief and actually promote social connections. But it also actually had feedback to the environment, because the more that I was doing it, the more I wanted to have diversity in the garden. And so I started planting, my husband started planting a few edible flowers. Those edible flowers have incredible polyphenols in them, and that's improving my diet. So the whole thing is this positive feedback loop that was actually happening. Really quite amazing. So what are these interventions? And I think this is kind of like frontier work now, is that, doctors might end up actually, instead of prescribing cortisone, which is what I was being given for many, many years to subside all the problems that I was having, instead of doing that, maybe actually prescribing nature is not a bad idea. And so, perhaps we should be doing that. Certainly, I think in environments where there are other potential benefits like food security, and so on, having and supporting food gardens somehow is really I think, a critical idea. And linked to this is urban planning and finding solutions for challenges through, like, for example, using nature as a filtration instead of a filtration plant, which is introducing nature back into an environment. But it might actually require more. And so these papers actually speak to that. So the one title says, actively noticing nature is not just time in nature, helps to promote nature connectedness. And the other paper said, visible garden biodiversity is associated with noticing nature and nature connectedness. So it does mean that we actually have to build in sort of somehow sensory engagement activities with and in nature in order for us to achieve this connectedness. And it might be that we need to start thinking, well, I think it certainly is the case, that, this worked for me, but maybe it won't work for a different culture or a different social ecological environment. So what does work in those environments? Maybe something more to do with ancestral linkages, or there might be many, many more things that we're missing by not doing research in this area on our continent. And so that's where I would like to see research going. So I want to conclude by this, and you can have a look at this lovely illustration. I was given permission by Brenna Quinlan to actually present this gardening as a revolutionary act. And, it's simple. It's, our grandmothers did it, but we seem to have no longer do that. We no longer have a garden in our backyard. We go down to the store. We need to start reintroducing these things back into our lives in order to actually, I think, reconnect. And I love the fact that she actually rekindles our connection with nature right up top there, just under gardening as a revolutionary act, along with all the other co-benefits that occur associated with that. So, if you're interested in seeing a bit more, I actually post these things onto Instagram. My daughter told me how to, and so I'm an Instagrammer. That's quite interesting. And I also post quite a lot of comments, some of them, whimsical, but some of them related to sustainability. And if you want to know a little bit more about my academic world, you can go and have a look at Google Scholar for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof, for such an interesting perspective. What I hear you telling us is that we are where we are in terms of climate change because of our disconnect to nature. So we need to go back, to connecting with the nature so that we appreciate it more. Then we'll cut less trees, will cause more damage to the environment because we appreciate the nature that is amongst us. Colleagues, is there any questions to Prof?
I've got some online. Shall I read them? I could read them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect message for Garden Week. Thank you for the encouragement to get back into our gardens, feeding ourselves with connection and connectivity. The other one says, wonderful insights. The use of hands is important to achieve mindfulness. This is what Mahatma Gandhi said, using the charka. This is when you use your putative self-strength in solitary. This is what gives you solutions for social ecological stress. And that's from Gyan, I think it's Gyan Sharma in India. So, yeah, yes, hi Gyan online. Thanks. So those are comments, but yeah, are there any questions? I'm interested to know. There are. Am I? Yes.
Broader question. Thank you very much for the perspective you gave. Well, I won't say that I'm going to give perspective from our lectures. The problem, I just want to hear from you. Food gardens and planting domestically and so on is often associated with people who have food security problems and poor people. How can we move beyond it? I see your experience, but how do we move beyond,
I think that this is where we need to actually do some research to be able to actually really get the answers which are fit for purpose. I think, I love the idea of allotments, and one of the challenges I think for people in poor environments is security. So, you would plant your stuff and just as you wanting to harvest, it's gone. So I think, there are some of those kinds of issues which would need to be addressed. But I think the allotment idea, which is a European idea, why can't we use that idea, so we can identify pieces of land that are unused nearby to places where, now I do know, and my colleague Rhoda Malchus spoke to me this morning about that there are some initiatives, some church initiatives, but I don't think it's enough. I think and part of it is also in the way that we plan our urban environments. So to be able to actually allow access to people to grow, and I think that we have to really understand the community too, because it seems to me that we did some work on nature-based solutions in the last couple of years, and one of them was working in Langerig, which is a community outside Franschhoek. And it was very interesting because the interventions that were put in place in that community, where there was social cohesion between the people, the Gogos, the women mostly in that community, that nature-based solution, which involved the community food garden as well, they actually survived. But where there wasn't the social connection, that nature-based solution had been put in place, but it actually just degraded very rapidly, and it went back to square one again very rapidly. So I think that these kinds of interventions probably need quite a bit of a sort of social intervention as much as the knowledge of how to grow your own vegetables. I think that's actually not too difficult. It's actually easier than you expect. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions online, audience? Okay, you also made I would say a profound quotation for me that says, "We will not succeed unless the general public cares." And caring and knowing, there's a distinction there. So how do we, shall I say, teach? How do we ensure people care? How do we do that? Because I think it's more difficult than teaching people to know.
So my point is that we have to start enhancing this connectedness. In order for us to care, we need to actually provide opportunities to connect people back. So Matt Zelstra, who did that wonderful PhD, he's been working a lot with children and actually taking children into nature as one way. So I think that there are a range of different things, but even old folks like me can still actually experience the benefits of this in surprising ways, actually. I think that there are a range of different activities that we can do, but I think it's around, for example, it could be, you provide parks, but you also provide exercises to, do bird watching, and so people are observing, or they're having some kind of an activity. Maybe it is just doing yoga in a park, or spending time in, providing places where people can feel peaceful and secure in order to just spend time alone or listen to the birds. So I think there's a range of different things, and it's going to be context specific though.
Yeah, I think it can work quite well if you start, with them young in terms of the kids to kind of, there's still a question. Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
How can this be worthwhile to inculcate in our course curriculum? Can you suggest? Yeah, well, this is an interesting one, so conservation ecology, the undergraduate program that I've been involved with, sort of essentially it was quite an interesting process to be involved in this because I came from botany and zoology, so that was my first department, sort of disciplinary, and then moved across into conservation ecology, which sits in a different faculty, sits in agri-sciences. Interesting that would be the case. And then with visas. But interesting was this idea that we need to teach a lot broader than just kind of understanding the sort of biophysical environment if we're going to really make a difference. And conservation is an example. There's quite a lot of resistance actually initially to doing this because we were, it was sort of considered as something that was watering down the discipline by doing this sort of more interdisciplinary subject choosing. So I think you have to be brave, and I think you have to be consistent, and we just carried on. We kept on. There was actually a rector's task team to actually see whether or not we really were relevant enough to be able to actually exist on this campus at that time. So it's quite interesting. But I think that both need to be there. It's not a case of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We still need to understand our ecological systems and how they function. We still need that disciplinary expertise, but we also need a wider understanding so we can actually make those connections, particularly the social ecological connections. So what I would love to see is actually much more interaction between social sciences and ecological sciences, because I think that's where the answer lies. And we've got to get over these structural challenges that happen in universities with different timetable slots and so on, so that we can do that. Because at the moment we're not, it's not so easy to interact across and bring those disciplines in. So, I think you have to be persistent, you have to keep on trying, and eventually it pays off because, now we do have a conservation ecology program on campus and, a successful one. And it's very interesting to experience the kind of students coming into the program as well. They definitely are, ones that really care, who want to do something about it. So they actually need to, they want to learn about this kind of thing. So, I hope that answered your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. That was an interesting perspective to say natures, and we should nurture nature. So that's a good one. So next up will be Miss Mimi Seifeld-Reth, my colleague. She is the Deputy Director Digital Scholarship at the library. Mimi will speak to open access at Stellenbosch University. Thank you, Mimi.
Okay, good afternoon. I promise I won't keep you long because I know it's already after 3. But anyway, thanks very much for joining us and staying until the bitter end. So just a short presentation just to remind us what we are celebrating this week, which is Open Access Week, and just looking at the library's journey over the last decade and a bit concerning open access. So Sorry. So anyway, over the last decade and so, or decade and a half, academic libraries have been reacting to profound shifts in scholarly communication brought about by developments in information technology and the internet. And these developments had inter alia led to the open access movement, and which of course strives to provide free and unhindered access to research output. And several studies claim that open access publishing leads to greater research impact through visibility and citation of research outputs, and the benefits of OA are widely documented. So open access is an ideal that has been embraced by the Library and Information Service at the university and has become a vehicle for increasing the impact of research at this institution and allowed the library to go on this journey. So the library's open access journey started in 2008 with the establishment of an of an institutional repository called Sun Scholar, and I hope you're all familiar with it. And with that also went the implementation of an electronic thesis and dissertation submission system. So today, over 14 years later, Sun Scholar hosts over 23,000 full-text items, research outputs, and the repository is quite widely used with approximately 600,000 visits a year and about 300,000 downloads. So in terms of accessibility, the material on Sun Scholar is harvested by big search engines such as Google and Google Scholar. And it's really on these platforms like Google Scholar where we can also trace the impact of citations and where the citations to items in the repository are evident. So then in 2011, the library's commitment to open access was furthermore manifested in the establishment of an open access publication fund in 2009, and importantly, we hosted the open access seminar in 2010, where Stellenbosch University became the first African university to sign the Berlin Declaration of Open Access to Knowledge in the Sciences and Humanities. In 2000, that's the publication fund. Unfortunately, we had to close the fund now because it was not sustainable for the library to fund this. We do feel strongly that it should be funded somewhere at the institution. But as you can see, the fund was there to help researchers publish their research in accredited open access journals, and over 1,000 articles has been funded from 2009 until last year. And we do still manage to a deposit account with Springer Nature, which at least gives a little bit of refund on article processing charges. So in 2011, we started Sun Journals, which is a journal hosting platform for we host open access research journals affiliated with Stellenbosch University. At the moment, we have about 24 active, maybe less, about 21 active journals that we host. And as I said, I think this data must be a bit old. I think this is from 2018. But usually it's about between 80 and 120 research outputs by Stellenbosch universities that are hosted in a range of these journals. And yes, the journals range from internationally accredited journals like South African Journal of Industrial Engineering, also to very much niche journals like the South African Journal of Enology and Viticulture, and of course sort of practitioners journals like Social Work, which is not really it's an academic journal, but you can also see it being used widely by practitioners. So in 2013, we hosted Sun Digital Collections, which is a digital heritage repository to showcase and allow access to the library's special and unique collections. Now, it's of course very different from an institutional repository. It's different to track citations to items within these collections, or to measure the impact of the use of these items. So, but what we can see is that these materials are being accessed and used in a range of outputs. There was an example of a digital image of one of the older maps in the library dating from 1630, which has been referenced in 2 book publications, 1 scholarly article and 1 conference paper since upload in 2013. So this is also continuing to grow. As you can see there, we already have over 30 collections now, and I think our total some items I think is around 14,000 at this point. And then the new kid on the block is of course Sun Scholar Data, Research Data Repository, which we launched in 2019. And this allows Stellenbosch University researchers to share and disseminate their research data in accordance with good research data management practices, and will serve to facilitate the findability, accessibility, and reusability of the university's research data. And it also allows data to be cited, and data citation underpins the recognition of data as a primary research output rather than as a byproduct of research. And then open access publishing at Stellenbosch University, we really try or strive obviously for the value of research for impact. We also try to show how open access is making a difference in terms of research impact. And it's quite surprising to see that last year 57% of all research output published by Stellenbosch University authors were actually published in open access. I must say I was actually quite surprised about that total. Also just some examples of some of the top 10 open access journals in which Stellenbosch University research is published last year and how it ranks. And then also we did a presentation at the annual general meeting earlier this year, also just to inform researchers and university management that you know the stuff that we do actually can have an influence on university rankings, because if we look at, for example, the QS World Rankings, 20% of the total is based on citations, and the Times Higher Education 30%. So increased citation is a very, very important thing, and we have shown that by publishing open access, the chances that your work is going to be read is greater, and greater chance of reading will obviously lead, hopefully, to a greater chance of citation. Some innovations that what we're looking at the moment for open access. We're improving analytics in terms of also showcasing research and seeing how the open access products are being used. Improving speed and accuracy, transitioning to be compatible with semantic web, not only the library catalog, but also our digital repositories, and find connections that exist between different library collections using data science techniques and making those available. And then another thing which is not mentioned here, but I can also just mention, is we've also been looking at the digital humanities and using our open access repository Sun Digital to host a few digital humanities collections in collaboration with some of the departments on campus. We actually have some very nice flagship projects which we're also doing with the Transformation Office, visual redress and transformation. So, okay, thank you very much.
So the Open Access Publishing Fund closed last year. I'm finding it very interesting because this is completely, the open access costs are really driving our behavior. We have to now shop around not for the journals we want to publish them, but for ones we can afford to publish them. And that is really, really a challenge, I think. It's a big problem. And I think it's going to really impact our visibility in the future because, often we'll go for journals just because they're hybrid and that's behind a paywall because they're cheaper.
No, absolutely. The problem is with these APCs is somebody actually did a study on it also. There's no rhyme or reason. I mean, it differs literally from 5 cents to billions of dollars, literally. So yeah, it is a very big problem. But as I said, we strongly feel that this is something that the university should look at very seriously in terms of our funding.
To re-subsidize that cost.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
anything else?
I just wanted to add to that.
You're welcome.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that, but no, not that I'm the one you should be speaking to, but on our website we do try to show which journals we subsidize to help our authors, align with wanting to do the open access thing. So we've got Biomed Central, and we've got, there's a couple of, several journals that indicate on our site that we will help in subsidizing, or where you pay, or we pay, you do not pay, you just publish. So, but yeah, like I said, I'm not the one that's the expert on. I just know that we do have some journals that we try to help our authors, our researchers publish in them, and we will carry the cost.
Okay, there's nothing online. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Prof, it's also something that was identified in our recent self-evaluation and peer review report as one of the key things that we should look at. But of course, we do know that it should be the whole university, not just the library. But it's something that we'll look into going into the future. But of course, as she's saying, there's also an agreement that we normally sign with the publishers like Wiley and others, where authors from Stellenbosch can be able to publish in certain journals or in open access journals within, not even just open access, some hybrid, within those, or that are published by those publishers free of charge. So you don't pay, they don't charge you APCs. So you just need to look at maybe you can send in, the LIB guide, so that you know which publishers we actually work with, where you don't pay APCs, basically. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Mimi. I think the questions have already started. Unless there's another question, I think we've run out of time a little bit. Is there another question online? Okay, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate your time. Holding this event demonstrates our support for the International Open Access Week. We are guided by the belief that sharing knowledge is a human right, and tackling the climate crisis requires the rapid exchange of knowledge across geographic, economic, and disciplinary boundaries, as articulated by the organizers of Open Access Week. We know that seamless sharing of information cannot be possible without open access. The theme for this year is Open for Climate Justice. According to SPAC, which is the organizers of this, of Open Access Week, this year's theme was meant to provide space for partnerships and collaboration to act and raise awareness about how open access enables climate justice. I wish to add that it was meant to provoke international debates on climate change or justice and open access in general. The theme placed climate justice at the center of socio-political and economic development realm. That way, it resonates very well with SDG 13 of UN Agenda 2030, which places climate change at the core of development. In the past 3 days, various speakers sought and managed to enlighten us about climate change, climate responsibility, climate justice, and their linkages to open access. The first sub-theme on Wednesday was on climate diversity, followed by the sub-theme on climate studies and global leadership on Thursday, and then by today's sub-theme on climate sustainability and open access at SU. Through the various presentations, we know now that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. We knew even before. We heard of how states and companies from the global north are accountable for the bulk of the effects of climate change. It was Professor Ruppel who stated that most affluent countries are responsible for more than half of the greenhouse emissions in the world. Amidst all, we are reminded that climate change affects the society at large, as it can lead to unnecessary crisis, harm to humans and animals alike, destroy the places we inhabit, and wreak havoc on our livelihoods. Hence, it was important to hear the voices of this society as presented by Dr. Dominic Okoliko the other day. Like all political and socio-economic challenges, climate change has much more devastating effects to the vulnerable, the small farming and fishing communities who depend on the environment and climate for their livelihoods, and those who are not privileged enough to live in well-insured brick and mortar houses. Its effects are felt more in poorer countries than the rich, hence the reference to the North-South divide. Already, it can widen the gender inequalities, thereby impacting the realization of SDG 5 on gender equality. Already, UNICEF estimates that climate change could soon force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. It is critical, therefore, that we all hold hands and engage in redress activities where we seek to reverse or minimize some of our action that may lead to climate change. We heard that from the speakers today. It is clear that all entities, including universities and libraries, ought to play a role in seeking to address climate change. Through the presentations in this Open Access Week, it was clear that fully embracing open access is critical to the university and libraries' response to climate change and achievement of climate justice. By opening up information for access to others for free, we will increase or decrease the need for paper and save trees. We will ultimately contribute to greening of the environment. The information itself will serve to enlighten the communities about the impending, if not the prevailing, disaster. I would like to thank the following presenters for sharing their research perspectives and views or thoughts with us about such important issues. Professor Oliver C. Rappel, Dr. Dominic A. Okoliko, Professor Helen M. de Klerk, Mr. Cutis Bailey, Professor Guy Mitchley, Yonela Mnwebisa, Yenziwe Mbuisa, Picho Makele Tabile, Kaylee Mare, Professor Chris Reddy, Dr. Flexin Chuma, Professor M.J. Boyson, Professor Karin J. Esler, and Ms. Mimi Seifeld-Reed. I also thank Mr. Peter Duplessis for expertly chairing yesterday's session. I would like to thank and congratulate the organizers of this event, who were able-led by Ms. Mimi Seifeld-Reed, for a well-organized Open Access Week, for such an interesting program, and for such excellent speakers. Last but not least, I thank each and everyone who joined us in person or via MS Teams to listen to the presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope these presentations have helped us all to rethink some of our practices that contribute to climate change. Support for open access is one of many ways of ensuring climate justice. I thank you all and all the best. Thank you.
Yes. I also just want to say thank you for our online audience. It's Friday afternoon, I know, and even though you think you'll just quickly pop in and out, it took a long time that you have taken out of your schedule in order to get here. So for our audience that has dwindled, and for those who stuck it out to the end, we do have some quick nibbles, quick eats that's in our tea room. So you are more than welcome to just go up to our tea room and just grab a bag. Thank you so much. Pepler can guide our audience to the tea room. Thank you, Pepler, for volunteering. To our online audience, thank you for spending the afternoon with us.